Hey guys, I'm Redeem Zoomer, and today I'm making another video on behalf of Presbyterians for the Kingdom, which is the Reconquista nonprofit that we started to retake our denomination, the Presbyterian Church USA, and part of what we're doing is making theological content, easily explaining Protestant theology and Presbyterian theology, so if you want to support what we do, you can make a tax-deductible donation. The link is in the description. We really appreciate your support. So now some of you might be wondering, hey, RZ, are you getting back into Protestant apologetics? Well, I stepped back from Protestant apologetics a few months ago because most of modern Protestantism is not something that I really want to defend. I don't really feel like defending evangelical megachurches. But I do feel like defending mainline Protestantism. I'm probably the first distinctively mainline Protestant apologist on the internet. So I'm going to be explaining today why Protestants, specifically mainline Protestants, have apostolic succession. Apostolic succession is something a lot of people think about when they're choosing which church to join. They're like, I want a church that has apostolic succession. What does apostolic succession mean? You won't hear most Protestants talk about apostolic succession much because in modern times, the phrase apostolic succession refers to something that most Protestants don't believe in. Generally, it refers to this high church view of apostolic succession, where in order to have a valid church, you need to have an unbroken chain of bishops going back to the apostles. That's what most people mean when they use the phrase apostolic succession. And the only Protestants today that believe in that are like some Episcopalians slash Anglicans. Episcopalian and Anglican means the same thing. The other Protestant groups generally don't believe in that, so you won't hear Protestants use the phrase apostolic succession. So when outsiders say Protestants don't have apostolic succession, and when most Protestants don't talk about apostolic succession, it can give you the idea that Protestants don't have apostolic succession, but there is a version of apostolic succession that we do believe in, that we do have. But first, let's talk about the high church view of apostolic succession that some high church Episcopalians believe in. This is what most people mean when they say apostolic succession. It's this idea that in order to have a valid church, you need to have valid sacraments, a valid Eucharist that is like actually Jesus' body and blood. And in order to have a valid Eucharist, it needs to be consecrated by a valid priest. And in order to have a valid priest, he needs to be ordained by a valid bishop. And a valid bishop needs to have an unbroken chain going back to the apostles with this sacramental power passed on by the laying on of hands. So it's a very mechanical, very mystical view of apostolic succession. It's like apostolic succession actually transfers this indelible power going from the apostles to your priest himself. It's a very mystical view of how apostolic succession works. Now, this is not something that Presbyterians believe in, because Presbyterians don't have bishops as a distinct office from elder, and Presbyterians generally reject the idea that your salvation is tied to these mechanical processes. What we do believe in is an apostolic succession where certain people approve of the ordination of other people. Presbyterians believe that to be qualified, a minister needs to be ordained by other ministers. We would fully agree with these high church people that any Joe Schmo can't just start his own church in his basement. To have a valid pastor, that pastor needs to be ordained by other pastors. Because if he's not, then where is he getting his approval from? So no, there are a lot of these non-denominational churches that spring up out of nowhere because some random guy felt like starting his own church and he ordained himself, or he got some people together and his congregation ordained him. No, Presbyterians reject that. Presbyterians believe that a valid minister must be ordained by other valid ministers, and that necessarily creates a chain going back to the apostles. But we don't think there's any mystical power that's conferred. It's about proper order. It's about doing things decently in order. It's about pastors having the proper qualifications. But the advantage of this view is it makes room for exceptions. Because if there's some, tribe on an island and a Bible washes up on the shore of that island, they can convert to Christianity right then and there. They don't need to wait until some bishop arrives at that island. Now, most of them will eventually want to enter into communion with other larger churches. It's sort of how the St. Thomas Christians in India happened. Like, the St. Thomas Christians in India were thriving for the first few centuries of the church. They eventually did want bishops from the other church to sort of validate their orders, but it's not like they didn't have any valid churches before that. So the Presbyterian view has this apostolic succession being normative, but it's not absolutely necessary to have this mechanical chain of humans going back to the apostles. It's normative, but it's not absolutely necessary. So here's how you can compare the High Church view of apostolic succession to the Presbyterian view. The High Church view, once again, this unbroken chain of bishops back to the apostles, it's absolutely necessary. And for Presbyterians, it's just normatively necessary. We do make room for exceptions. In the High Church view, apostolic succession can only be passed on through bishops as a distinct office from elder. And Presbyterians believe that elder is the same as bishop. So we think apostolic succession can be traced back through elders and pastors. So Presbyterians technically don't have an unbroken chain of bishops going back to the apostles, but we think all pastors are bishops. So in that sense we do, because we have an unbroken chain of pastors going back to the apostles. In the High Church view, the purpose of apostolic succession is passing on this sacramental power. It's like this person touches this person touches this person, and that conveys this sacrament-doing power. Whereas Presbyterians believe that the purpose of apostolic succession is guarding correct teaching. It's more about doctrine than sacramental power. And in the High Church view, the laying on of hands is absolutely necessary to confer this sacramental power. In the Presbyterian view, laying on of hands is proper order, but nothing mystical is going on. We don't think ordination itself is a sacrament. And in the High Church view, ordination is indelible. So once someone is ordained, that person is ordained for life. It's like baptism. Once you're baptized for life. They think ordination is like that. We don't. Presbyterians will remove someone from ordination and then they stop being an ordained minister if their church removes them. Like if a minister has some scandal or commits abuse, their ordination is removed and they're no longer a minister in any sense. All right, so the important thing is, first of all, what does Scripture say? Scripture never uses the phrase apostolic succession. So the Church Fathers are indeed a secondary authority for Protestants. That's why I say Protestantism is different than like evangelicalism. Most evangelicals don't really think about the Church Fathers much. It is important to know what the Church Fathers said, because even though they don't have the same authority as the Bible, you know, if your interpretation of Scripture is something that nobody ever thought of before, it's probably wrong. So the Church Fathers often do use the terms bishops and apostolic succession. So when a lot of people hear that for the first time, they think, well, obviously this must be talking about this High Church view, because when modern people say the word apostolic succession, they are referring to that High Church view of this mystical sacramental power being transferred between bishops by the laying on of hands. And because the Church Fathers use the same word, because they use the word apostolic succession, people assume that is what they're referring to. But it's a word concept fallacy to assume, without evidence, that they are referring to that. So we should look at what the Church Fathers say in detail to see, are they actually talking about this High Church view of apostolic succession, or are they talking about something more like what the Presbyterians say? So Presbyterians believe that elder is identical to bishop. So a lot of people would say apostolic succession can only be transferred through bishops, and if that's the case, then only Episcopalians have apostolic succession. They're the only Protestants that have apostolic succession. But in the New Testament, elder and bishop are used interchangeably. Titus 1, verses 5 to 7. Paul says, "This is why I left you in Crete, so that you might put what remained into order and appoint elders in every town. If anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife, and his children are believers and not open to the charge of debauchery and insubordination, for a bishop, as God's steward, must be above reproach." So the direct implication is that every elder is a bishop. The converse isn't necessarily true. He's not necessarily saying that every bishop is an elder, but he's saying every elder is a bishop. So even if apostolic succession can only be passed on through bishops, Titus says that every elder is a bishop. Elder is the same as minister and pastor, by the way. So this means that apostolic succession can be traced through pastors and elders because they are bishops. This sentence would make no sense if not every elder is a bishop. It'd be like saying a senator must be blameless, for a president must be above reproach. And the vast majority of scholars, even Roman Catholic and Episcopalian scholars, will admit that, yes, in the New Testament, elder and bishop are used interchangeably. And even later medieval theologians like Peter Lombard, he admits that in the early church, the apostles only left two offices, the office of deacons and the offices of elder/bishop, because elder and bishop were the same thing. Now, pretty early on in the church, elder and bishop were distinguished. This happened in the 2nd century, but in the New Testament, in the 1st century, elder and bishop were the same. And this isn't just something Presbyterians made up. St. Jerome says that this was the case. St. Jerome says in his epistle, his commentary on Titus, he says, "Elder is identical with bishop, and before the urging of the devil gave rise to factionalism in religion, so much that it was said among the people, I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, I am of Cephas, the churches were governed by a joint council of elders. The consensus of the scholarship is that New Testament churches were run by a plurality of elders, and this structure of bishops is something that developed later. It developed out of necessity to deal with heresies, but it is not something that has always been there. So, if elder was identical to bishop in the beginning, then apostolic succession being traced through elders is valid. So, First Clement is one of the earliest sources that we have outside the Bible. Clement is one of the apostolic fathers, Clement of Rome. He says, thus preaching through the countries and cities, the apostles appointed the first fruits, having first proved them by the Spirit, to be bishops and deacons of those who would afterwards believe. So Clement doesn't have this three-office structure. He doesn't list elders and deacons and bishops as separate offices the way like Ignatius of Antioch does. Scripture says the apostles appointed elders and deacons. St. Clement says the apostles appointed bishops and deacons. And in Scripture, elder and bishop are interchangeable. So it's pretty clear that Clement only sees two offices, with elders and bishops being basically the same thing. That's also true in most of the apostolic fathers, except for Ignatius. Ignatius is really when you start to see the distinction between elder and bishop. Ignatius is an Episcopalian. But succession is still traced through elders. Even if there was eventually a distinction between elder and bishop, it took a long time to evolve into the modern distinction that like Episcopalians have. For a while, these bishops were just like highly exalted elders that were exalted above the other elders. So since elders are bishops, apostolic succession can be traced through them. And even when the church fathers begin to distinguish between elder and bishop, they still affirm that succession can be traced through both, because even though in the 2nd century, elder and bishop start to become distinct offices, they don't become so distinct such that succession can't be traced through elders. So Irenaeus believed that both elders and bishops have succession from the apostles because during his time the distinction was more of a functional distinction than an ontological distinction. St. Irenaeus says, but again, when we refer to that tradition which originates from the apostles and which is preserved by the means of the succession of presbyters in the churches, and by the way, presbyter means elder. That's why we're called Presbyterian. We are the church of the elders. They object to tradition, saying that they themselves are wiser not merely than the presbyters, but even than the apostles. So Irenaeus is talking about apostolic succession. He says succession of tradition from the apostles, but there's two things you should observe. Number one, he says that presbyters, elders, have succession from the apostles. And number two, he's talking about the succession of teaching. He's talking about apostolic succession, but what does he say is actually being traced back to the apostles? Not some mystical sacrament power. He's talking about teaching. Irenaeus also says, wherefore it is incumbent to obey the presbyters who are in the church, those who, as I have shown, possess the succession from the apostles. Presbyters have apostolic succession according to Irenaeus. Now, Irenaeus is not infallible. Maybe he's wrong, but generally when people talk about apostolic succession, they support this idea of apostolic succession from early church fathers such as Irenaeus. But those early church fathers say that succession can be traced through presbyters, and they primarily talk about succession as a way of preserving correct doctrine. Then there's also Ignatius of Antioch. He says, I exhort you to study to do all things with a divine harmony, while your bishop presides in the place of God, and your presbyters in the place of the assemblies of the apostles. Now, I'm not saying Ignatius was a Presbyterian. Ignatius clearly had an Episcopalian view of church government. He clearly had a three-office view of church government. Now, it should be known that in Ignatius's time, there's not evidence that a bishop was like a regional monarch of the church. In Ignatius's time, the bishop was more like a senior pastor of a church today, where there is one pastor who's sort of the monarch, but it's just a monarch of a local church. There's no evidence that in Ignatius's time, the bishop had authority over an entire region, like the bishop does in modern Episcopal churches. So, in Ignatius's time, the presbyters of the local church still shared authority with the bishop. That's why Ignatius says the bishop is in tune with the presbyters, like the lyre and the strings of the lyre. So even though Ignatius does have a distinction between elder and bishop, it's not nearly as much of a distinction as you see later on. So he does believe in a three-office view of the church, but there's no evidence in Ignatius that he believes sacramental power is the material of apostolic succession. There's no evidence that he believes sacramental power is what is conveyed in succession. He does say that that presbyters stand in the place of the apostles. He doesn't talk much about succession. The first instance in church history where we see people clearly talking about apostolic succession is later in Irenaeus, but regardless, he says presbyters are in the place of the apostles. Okay? So, why succession even matters? So, when we're trying to know what the church fathers meant by succession, we should look at how they argue for succession. So, the high church view of succession, in the high church view, the purpose of succession is sacramental power. So, if the high church view was what the church fathers believed, they would have said, like, hey, heretics, you're preaching heresy? Well, your bishops don't have succession, so it doesn't matter. You don't have valid sacraments or valid churches. If the church fathers believed in that type of succession, we should see them arguing like that, because that is how high church denominations will argue. But the original view of succession, if that's what the church fathers meant by succession, if they meant the more Presbyterian view, where succession is the passing on of apostolic teaching, then it'd be like, oh, you think Jesus meant that? Well, my teacher was taught by the apostles who were taught by Jesus. So we probably know a little bit more about what Jesus meant than you do. So that's the purpose of apostolic succession in the beginning. This sacramental power, that's a medieval development. The original purpose of apostolic succession was much more common sense. It was like, yeah, you Gnostics think that Jesus had some secret code in the Bible that only you can figure out. Well, my teacher was taught by Jesus himself, so we probably understand what Jesus meant a bit more than you do. There's nothing mystical about apostolic succession. That was the original meaning. And there's evidence of this, because in the ancient world, this is exactly how philosophers would argue for the legitimacy of their teachings. They would say, oh, well, I'm not just some nobody philosopher. I was taught by this guy, who was taught by this guy, who was taught by Aristotle or Plato. So when these early church fathers are in this, Greco-Roman context, and they're using this idea of succession going back to Jesus, they're just paralleling the idea of the time where people would trace their succession back to a known authority, like a famous philosopher or a famous rabbi or something. So, if the church fathers really did believe in the modern high church view of apostolic succession, and when I say the church fathers, I'm talking about like the first few centuries. If they really believed in that, we should see them arguing the way modern high church people argue. Like, yeah, well, your argument is totally irrelevant because you don't have valid sacraments, because you don't have a valid chain of bishops going back to the apostles. But that's not how they argue. If you really look at what they mean and how they are using apostolic succession, it is a lot closer to the Presbyterian view of apostolic succession. All right, so here's some evidence that, according to the church fathers, true succession is about doctrine. They directly say this in many places. So, the church has always had some concept of apostolic succession, ever since Irenaeus. But the idea that it is mechanically necessary for this sacrament power to be transferred, that is a medieval notion that is read back into the scripture and the church fathers. Yes, a physical lineage is normative, it's ideal, but it's not absolutely necessary. So here's a quote from Tertullian. Now you might say, oh, Tertullian, he's unreliable because he became a Montanist later. Well, Tertullian is not a liar. And during his time, everyone saw Tertullian as a reliable source. Even if Tertullian himself is not considered a saint by some people, he's still just observing what churches were actually like during his time. So he says, to this test, therefore, they will be submitted for proof by those churches who, although they derive not their founder from apostles or apostolic men, as being of a much later date, for they are in fact being founded daily, yet since they agree in the same faith, they are accounted as not less apostolic because they are akin in doctrine. Tertullian says it directly. He's saying that during his time, there were churches that were seen by everyone as true churches, that did not have this mechanical apostolic succession, that did not trace their line of bishops back to the apostles, but they were still seen as equally apostolic. Why? Because they were faithful to apostolic doctrine. So the purpose of apostolic succession isn't that this mechanical, tag, this magic cheese touch of sacrament power is absolutely necessary for a valid church. It's that tracing your ordination back to the apostles is normally necessary to guard correct doctrine. But if a church happens to have correct doctrine without that, then it's not a huge problem. That's what Tertullian is saying. And Gregory of Nazianzus is a bit later. He's in the, 4th century. He was living during the time of the Arian crisis, when a lot of bishops who did have this mechanical apostolic succession, who could trace their ordination back to the apostles, were still committing heresy. They were still denying that Jesus was God. So here's what he says in response to that. He says, succession should be esteemed by piety, not by the seat. Whoever holds the same doctrine of faith possesses the same seat. Whoever opposes the same seat should be considered an enemy. One who professes the same doctrine is a partner of the same throne, but one who upholds contrary opinions should be regarded as an adversary on the throne. While the former has the name of succession, the latter has the reality and truth of succession. It's very, very clear from St. Gregory the Theologian. If you have this mechanical line of bishops back to the apostles, that's an outward succession. That's a nominal succession. And that still has its purpose. That's still normatively useful. But the true succession, the true inward succession, is doctrine, a succession of doctrine from the apostles. And then once again, Irenaeus says, we are in a position to reckon up those who were by the apostles instituted bishops in the churches, and to demonstrate the succession of these men to our times, those who neither taught nor knew of anything like what these heretics rave about. So Irenaeus is arguing against heretics, and he is saying, we, who have succession from the apostles, don't know any of these crazy things that you guys are teaching. So if what you guys are teaching is actually in accordance with the apostles, why didn't we or any of our teachers ever hear of them? Because our teachers were taught by teachers who were taught by the apostles. That is what Irenaeus is saying. That is what apostolic succession truly means. So Protestants have retained apostolic succession. Yes, Protestants did split from the Roman Catholic Church. I would say it wasn't a voluntary schism. They got kicked out. It's not like Martin Luther just said, well, I have a different personal interpretation of the Bible, and just walked out the door. All the reformers wanted to stay in the church and reform the church, but they all got excommunicated. Luther got excommunicated, and then at the Council of Trent, all Protestants got excommunicated. But they still retained their lineage, because the first Protestant ministers, like Luther and Zwingli and Knox, were originally ordained as Roman Catholic priests, which are presbyters and elders. And all future mainline Protestant ministers trace their ordination back to them. So, the minister of my PCUSA church, he can trace his ordination back to the first presbytery in America, started by Francis Makemie. And he can trace his ordination back to Scotland and John Knox, who was a Catholic priest. So Protestants, mainline Protestants, just trace their ordination through the Catholic Church, because that is where we are rooted. And the Scottish Presbyterians who really framed Presbyterian doctrine, the guys who wrote the Westminster Confession of Faith, were very clear that a true minister must be ordained by other ministers. There are very rare exceptions, but it's not normative. They did not permit random people to just go starting their own churches willy-nilly. And Presbyterians, even in through and through corruptions, even in cases where the Presbyterian Church has been a bit shaky in terms of its doctrines, they still upheld this principle of polity really well. Presbyterians have always had the strict rule that a true minister must be ordained by other ministers. Presbyterians are very strict about the way we do things. The same is true of Methodists, the same is true of Lutherans, the same is true of Episcopalians, but Episcopalians have bishops, so obviously they have succession. And Congregationalists and Baptists is a bit more shaky. It depends on which Baptist you're talking about. Like, traditional Northern American Baptists, yeah, they have succession. Random Baptist preachers who started a church in their basement, it's a bit more shaky. They're like non-denominational and everything but name. So that leads me to the next thing. So maybe mainline Protestants have apostolic succession. What about non-denominational churches? I'm guessing that the majority of you guys watching this video right now who would identify as Protestant in some way go to some non-denominational or evangelical church, because a lot of Gen Z Protestants, or I don't think they're really Protestant, but a lot of Gen Z people who consider themselves Protestant are really part of this non-denominationalism. So theoretically, there are some non-denominational churches that might be able to trace their ministers back to the Reformers and then back to the Apostles. It's not expected, it's not normative, and because there's not any brand recognition on non-denominational churches, there's basically no way to know. Like, you theoretically could investigate the history of a non-denominational church and find it out. But generally speaking, most non-denominational churches and most modern evangelical Baptist churches, again, this doesn't apply to traditional mainline Baptists, doesn't even apply to Southern Baptists necessarily, but most non-denominational churches or non-denominational Baptist independent churches do not really have succession. Most of them just started out of thin air. And this was greatly condemned by all the Protestant reformers. So that's why I say evangelicalism, as it's generally understood, is not Protestantism. Evangelicalism, as it's understood today, the people who taught the things that evangelicals are teaching today back in the 1500s were considered more heretical by the reformers than the Catholics. So I'm not saying either is heretical. I'm just saying the reformers saw themselves as closer to Roman Catholicism than to the Anabaptists. And modern evangelicalism is much closer to the Anabaptists than to the mainstream magisterial reformers. So yes, if you are in Somalia and you start a church underground, obviously that church can still be said to have apostolic succession if it's faithful to apostolic doctrine. But if you're in America, where there's tons of historic churches all around, and you still just start churches willy-nilly out of thin air, those churches can't be said to have apostolic successions. They lack qualifications, they lack normative authority. So guys, thank you for watching this video. Once again, if you want to support what we do here at Presbyterians for the Kingdom, you can make a tax-deductible donation, or if you want to support me personally, I'll link my Patreon in the description. But as always, thank you for watching this video. You can find a based mainline Protestant church also in the description, and I will see you guys later. God bless.